Afternoon, evening, morning, whenever it is. This is Overviews Boxing, talking about what we usually talk about on here: recent history in professional boxing. And today, our topic is the 2010 to 2015 middleweight division. The middleweight division could not, only the heavyweight division is bigger than the middleweight division. Goes all the way back. Middleweights are close to the size of the quote average man. Today, the average man is 5'10" and a half. When they're young and in shape, about 165 pounds. A middleweight is 160 pounds. All right. Often, if you go through, they range anywhere from 6'2". You'll get some tall 6'2" guys and some short 5'7", 5'8" guys. But most of the guys are going to be right around 5'10" to 6 feet, 5'9" to 6 feet. And that probably has a lot to do with the popularity of the middleweight division. All right, what we want to talk about today, the past: Stanley Ketchel, Bob Fitzsimmons. All right, turn of the century: Sam Langford, superstar middleweights, Barney Ross. All right, continuing through, the heyday of the middleweight division is hard to pick because there have been so many great eras. The late 40s: Tony Zale, Marcel Zidane, Jake LaMotta, the Raging Bull, Rocky Graziano, and the most famous, Sugar Ray Robinson. All right, and that era passed on with Robinson to Bobo Olson, Gene Fulmer, Carmen Basilio, Randy Turpin. All right, and then that era finally passed through to Emil Griffith, Nino Benvenuti. All right, and that era passed on to the 70s, the rise of Rodrigo Valdez, Carlos Monzon, right, who dominated the 70s and many considered the greatest middleweight of all time. Now, a lot of people are going to pick Sugar Ray Robinson, all right? And Monzon dominated that era. In the 80s, early 80s, you start to see Vito Antuofermo, Alan Minter, but a guy rises up out of Brockton, Massachusetts, and Newark, New Jersey, to beat all those guys and be another person in the argument for the greatest middleweight of all time: marvelous Marvin Hagler. Marvin Hagler had some contemporaries who battled him up from the welterweights, the other probably most famous non-heavyweight division. Sugar Ray Robinson came up from welterweight, and later Sugar Ray Leonard in the 80s comes up from the welterweight division, and with him he brings Thomas the Hitman Hearns, and they started a tremendous era. Also coming with them, Roberto Duran, who is up all the way from lightweight, right, and makes noise in that era. Iran Barkley, all right, and in that era leads its way out to the next wave: Michael Nunn, James Lights Out Tony, Mike McCallum, the Body Snatcher, and then on to Bernard Hopkins, the Ageless Wonder, the Executioner, and the great Roy Jones. A lot of people would consider that the greatest age of the middleweights. All right, then from there, Bernard Hopkins, the Ageless Wonder, passes through to Kelly Pavlik, Olympic hero and world champion, and Hopkins finally conqueror, Jermaine Taylor. And then that takes us into Kelly Pavlik will lose to a guy named, he'll lose to Hopkins in a non-title fight, and he'll lose to a guy named Sergio Martinez. All right, and Sergio Martinez takes us into our current era. All right, And what we'll do is we're going to go over a lot of these guys. Some of the names you're going to see. All right, you'll see names like this guy, Felix Sturm. It's probably the star of a great German era, one of the greatest German eras, the 2010 to 2015 period in boxing history. All right, Felix Sturm's middleweight champion for much of the time between 2010 and 2014. Holds the title twice, holds 2 or 3 different belts. All right, at that same time period, Arthur Abraham is a big star at 168. Also champions at 160, Sam Solomon, a guy named Sebastian Sylvester, another guy named Sebastian Zibic held titles. All right, and also during that time period is the heyday of the Klitschko era, who are actually Ukrainian, but they have their greatest financial attendance success, popularity in Germany during that 2010 to 2015 period. All right, so what we want to do is just show you a few of the guys, some guys that you will see during that time period. Canelo Alvarez gets a belt. All right, towards the end of that era. All right, Gennady Golovkin, Daniel Jacobs are all factors. He's a guy who held a belt during that time period. And some people forget that he held a belt. Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. All right, and Chavez Jr. Is actually champion. Not in this fight, but during that time period, Chavez Jr. beat Sebastian Vidic, another champion, Andy Lee. He will fight Alvarez. He's actually a very talented fighter. All right, towards the end, 2014, 2015. A guy shows up on the scene. From Kazakhstan. Guy by the name of Gennady Golovkin. Right, and Gennady Golovkin, of course, in the next 5 years, will have 2 famous pitched battles with Canelo Alvarez. But during this time period, they are not yet on that level. Also, already appearing, it's a guy still going strong, Danny Jacobs. Here taking on Canelo. All right, a guy who has not fought those guys, but has been a champion through the era, and maybe we're going to see him soon fight. But right at the end of that era, this guy shows up on the scene. 2015, defeating Andy Lee and becoming WBO champion, Billy Joe Saunders. So Saunders, Jacobs, Canelo held titles during that time period. Also, Miguel Cotto held a middleweight title during that time period. But they were not the meat of the era, and they were not the main fighters. All right, what we want to do now is go over this era. All right, from 2010 to 2015, And we've already said when this era started, it was a heavy European era. You had Felix Sturm fighting in Germany with several other strong champions fighting in that era at 160 and 168. Right, with Arthur Abraham, Felix Sturm, Zibik, Solomon, Sylvester. Right, so it was a big era for the nation of Germany. Right, and all of Europe. Also out of Australia, Daniel Gill is a consistent champion. From the United Kingdom, Ireland, British Isles area, Matthew Macklin, Martin Murray, Darren Barker are all major contenders or champions during that era. And they all come to America and fight Martinez and Andy Lee. Can't leave Andy Lee out. They battle Canelo and Martinez during that era, and Peter Quillen and some of the guys who are big during that time period. All right. What we want to do as we go through this video, we want to go over by organizations. All right, WBO, WBA, IBF, WBC, and then we'll go over sort of the timeline for all four of those. It's so different now than the previous eras. When we do the 30s, there's one champion. By the time you get to the 2000s, the WBO comes up through Europe, which is a factor here. It comes up through Europe and becomes a major belt. So it's 4 instead of 3. Right? And the European influence, WBO, is fully recognized on the European and English circuit before it is on the American circuit. So let's go over the WBO first. All right, the WBO starts off with one of the bigger names of the era, Sergio Martinez. Sergio Martinez has moved up from 154 and become a big factor. All right, Sergio Martinez gets the WBO belt, but he also, Sergio Martinez is an Argentinian boxer, great athlete, one of the best athletes in the last 50 years to box, plays soccer, plays basketball, tremendous leaping ability, explosion, dunks of basketball, tremendous speed, would beat most fighters in a foot race, in any kind of cone drills. Starts boxing late and is actually old, although he does not look it in the ring, but he's older for a champion. Doesn't really become a major contender till his late 20s, and doesn't win a title into his 30s, and is dominant, until his finally has injuries, mainly a knee injury that finally stops him. But at that point, he was 37 years old. Martinez becomes champion, and he gets big on the European scene, but he breaks through and becomes a champion in the United States. And he is signed by HBO, so he is not as interested in that WBO belt, and he gives it up. All right, is stripped, and that opens the title to a couple of new contenders battling it out. Dmitry Pirog, who is wins the title. All right, Dmitry Pirog is a sad story. Dmitry Pirog becomes WBO champion by defeating Daniel Jacobs. All right, and he was probably going to be a star. All right, Pirog, 6'1", Russian amateur background, has power, has some speed, has a lot of boxing technique, pretty much has it all. Maybe he would have dominated the division. Maybe he would have dominated the era. All right. What would have been a Gennady Golovkin versus Dmitry Pirog battle would have been like. But he defeats another guy, all right, who will come up, defeats Danny Jacobs, a very young Danny Jacobs who unknowns at the time, actually has spinal cancer. Purog knocks out Jacobs, all right, in Vegas, becomes the champion. He defends the championship 2 times. Vegas, Jacobs goes and actually goes recovery, defeats the disease, comes back, and ends up getting a WBA title and a WBF title after 2015, and is a contender at 168 now. But Purog defends the title 2 times, gets a back injury, is thought to be coming back, never comes back, never recovers. There are disc injuries, nerve damage, and surprisingly, it's Purog who has a very short career, not Jacobs. All right, so Purog ends up having to give up the title. That title is then battled for by Hassan Ndam, who is still battling it out today, and another fighter who's still going, but not at the top level, Peter Quillen. And Peter Quillen defeats Hassan Ndam and becomes the WBO champion. All right. Ndam later in 2016-17 will get the WBA regular by beating Murata, but he will lose the title. All right. And here is Peter Quillen. Quillen defeats Ndam, all right, and becomes the champion. All right. So Quillen then goes on and becomes the champion. He holds it, defends it a couple of times, and ends up giving it up, looking for a bigger payday versus some up-and-coming stars. And Andy Lee, who he has a draw with, Irish Andy Lee, who trains out of the Kronk Gym in Detroit and actually has most of his big fights in the U.S., becomes a champion. Andy Lee eventually has a battle with fellow British Isles star Billy Joe Saunders and loses in 2015. So that's what's going on with the WBO championship. Starts off with Sergio Martinez. You have the sad Dmitry Purog story. What might have been. Have some pretty big names that are still going, and then Dom, Quillen, Andy Lee, who's Tyson Fury's cousin and current trainer, and Billy Joe Saunders, a young Billy Joe Saunders who's still going and still a major factor, but now it's super middleweight after holding the title for nearly 4 years. All right, so that moves us to the IBF. In the IBF, you have a lot of action. All right, just because you haven't seen the guy, I want to show you a couple guys who held the title, fought for the title. Sebastian Sylvester, and you probably have not seen this fella. All right, Sebastian Sylvester, another German fighter. Sebastian Sylvester. All right, Sebastian Sylvester starts off the decade, got the title in 2009. He's finally beaten by a guy, underestimated guy, Daniel Geale. Daniel Geale is from Australia. Daniel Geale we'll talk about a while because he holds the title twice, 2 different title areas. He's the IBF champion as well as fights Martinez, fights Macklin, fights Barker. But Daniel Geale, very athletic, just 5'9", tremendous conditioning, does not have a lot of power and is not very big or tall for a middleweight. All right, Gil defeats Sebastian, holds on to the title for a while, a couple of years, fights on HBO, tries to get the title back versus Martinez. Finally, he is defeated by Darren Barker. Darren Barker is the UK fighter who actually gets the title, even though Martin Murray and Matthew Macklin may have had been better over the long haul of the era. All right, it is Barker who gets a knockout over Gil to win the title. All right, Darren Barker is becoming a big factor in training and managing in England today. So he is one of the guys who is retired. All right, so it goes from Sebastian Sylvester, Daniel Gil, to Darren Barker. Barker's about 5'10", another smaller heavyweight. He has more power than most of the guys. He gets the title, does not hold it long, comes up to our good friend, maybe the dominant guy of the era, but not known heavily by Americans, Felix Sturm. All right, Felix Sturm, we'll show you a few times. Sturm is fought 2009 Oscar de la Hoya for the middleweight title, and many people thought he won in a very close fight. Has decent size, especially for that time. About 6 feet tall, very skilled, pretty athletic, orthodox fighter, and he will defeat Barker, all right, and really sort of retire or give way to Sam Solomon. Sam Solomon, another German fighter. Sam Solomon does not hold the title long. He is defeated by Jermaine Taylor, who makes a comeback. Jermaine Taylor was a big factor in 2005 to 10. He goes up to super middleweight, fights in that famous Super 6 series that Andre Ward won, and Carl Froch becomes a star, international star. Right, he comes out of that, gets the title back, defeats Solomon, looks good, but he's already starting to show signs of the probable brain damage, mental problems that have plagued him since. But Jermaine Taylor wins the title back. He started off the era, it's undisputed. So he does not hold the title for long, starts to have medical issues, and that opens up the title for David Lemieux from Canada, getting closer to North America, all right, because you're going from a U.S. guy to a Canadian guy, but fighting now moved from Europe over into the U.S. Gennady Golovkin comes and starts to unify and be the big star. All right, so that's what's going on in the IBF during that era. In the WBA, it's Felix Sturm. Felix Sturm becomes a champion. He gives way to Daniel Gil. Gil defeated Sturm. All right, and Gil gives up the title. He is the WBA super champion. And rising from the ashes is the guy who will be the next king, Gennady Golovkin, who at that time is fighting in Europe mostly, all right, and some in Australia. Golovkin, before he moves over and makes his U.S. debut, has become the regular champion. You're starting to see the knockout string. You're starting to hear him. Moves to HBO, knocks out everybody. A bigger, stronger guy than Gil and Barker and Macklin and Murray, and he just overwhelms most of those fighters. Never fought Cotto, who will hold the title, and does not fight Sturm, who's accused of revisionist, is accused of ducking Golovkin. And he does not fight Sergio Martinez, who is often considered the top guy of this era. All right, but so as the end of times, you now have Golovkin running the IBF and the WBA. All right. Also in the WBA, on the rise is a rejuvenated Daniel Jacobs, who ends up with the regular by defeating Sergio Mora. All right. And Peter Quillen. So you have Daniel Jacobs on the scene as a champion, Golovkin as a unified champion, and the very talented Billy Joe Saunders, who during this era defeats Lee and Chris Eubank. All right, so they're on the scene. In the WBC is the man of the hour, or maybe the man of the hour. All right, Sturm, often considered the top guy of the era, but the person most associated with the top guy in the middleweight division is our guy, Sergio Martinez. All right, and Martinez is, we've already said 154 champion, gave that up, beat Paul Williams, starts to beat lots of guys, has lots of 7 defenses, beats Kelly Pavlik, which is a highly respected win, beats Julio Cesar Chavez, another highly respected win. All right, beats Gill, beats Murray, beats Macklin. All right, smaller guy but explosive and more power than all of the other big stars of that era. Until Golovkin and those guys come on the scene. All right, so Martinez is stripped. All right, and Julio Cesar Chavez ends up with the title. Beats Sebastian Zivic, beats Andy Lee. So, you get some history that Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. was not ever good. That is not true. He lost to Martinez, but he had a tremendous battle and nearly won by knockout in the 12th round. So he beat some pretty good guys, and also took the guy that many thought the best guy of that era, to the wall. All right. So Martinez pretty much has been a champion from 2010 to 2014 without losing. He is older, and he looks so athletic in the ring that people don't realize he's actually 37 years old. He actually ends up having a torn ACL. And during the fight with Miguel Cotto, who has moved all the way up now from 140 up to middleweight, but Cotto is able to defeat an injured Martinez and become the champion. Right? He is a very small middleweight champion, and a guy who will become famous will defeat Cotto in a big fight for big money. Canelo Alvarez wins a close but unanimous decision over Cotto and becomes a champion, but he immediately gives it up. All right, he gives up the title, or stripped of the title, by the WBC, and Gennady Golovkin will end up with that title by 2016. So that is what is going on in that era during that time. All right, so what we want to talk about, all right, is sort of sum it up. Who were the great fighters? Definitely, Golovkin is a factor, but remember, all of his big accomplishments are 2014 on, and he's only a regular champion under a highly recognized WBA champion in Sturm until 2015. Billy Joe Saunders will probably historically turn out to be better than most of the WBO champions, with Pirog not being able to have a long career. Peter Quillen was very talented, but we'll probably say that the 5th best guy in that era will go with Daniel Gill. Gill holds the title for 2 years, beats Sturm, beats some other good fighters, beats Zivic. All right, actually pretty good in that era. Also with Gil, I have to give some respect to Julio Cesar Chavez. Beat Andy Lee, beat Civic, beat Sylvester. Had a great fight against Martinez. Obviously, could have done a lot more. So let's put Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. and Daniel Gil in fifth. In fourth, we're going to let's go ahead, because he was such a lightning rod of the era, such a representative guy. Actually, let's give a little credit here to Matthew Macklin, who actually did not win the title, but gave some of the tougher fights to Martinez, Gil, some others. All right, but let's, for fourth place, let's go with Peter Quillen. Quillen was very talented, a big guy. All right, has fought for the 168 title, is still going. Power. It's probably a little disappointing that he did not ever fight Golovkin, because he may have been big and strong enough to give him some trouble. All right, but picked Golovkin in that, but it may have been a better fight than some of the smaller, more skill-based guys would give him in that 16-17 era. Andy Lee is also a pretty good fighter in that era and actually got his hands on a belt. All right, the third best fighter of the era. Probably want to go out of the way and give it to Dmitry Pirog, who probably, or maybe, a fight between Martinez at full strength and Pirog at full strength probably would have been something to watch. Or throw in there a more dedicated, mentally stronger Chavez Jr. But the third best guy was Pirog, and he could have been more. 6'1", probably walked around 185 pounds, had power, had some speed. All right, the second best fighter of the era. All right, let's get a look at these guys. All right, Felix Sturm. All right, and Sturm, the German guy in the great German era. Second best fighter of the division. It's a guy that I did not respect as much until I've gone back and looked at him and looked at his record. All right, Felix Sturm. Just under 6 feet tall, big, thick, stronger guy, very effective, good hand speed, not a lot of power, but he does get some knockouts, knocked out Barker. So Sturm, was probably one of the greatest German fighters ever, but in first and the best fighter of that era, which some would argue, especially Americans, because usually the middleweight division kind of runs through here. It's either guys from the U.S. or who fight primarily out of the U.S., is Sergio Martinez, who does end up a guy fighting. He is a Western Hemisphere guy from Argentina, and he has his best days fighting on HBO in the U.S. Sergio Martinez is the best fighter in the middleweight division from 2010 to 2014. Now, there are going to be better guys that next year. You start to see Cotto, but more importantly, Alvarez, Jacobs, and Golovkin have appeared, the dominant guys for that next 5 years. So they have shown up on the scene, but an unusual era. The middleweight division, 2010 to 2015. The guy we pick is the man, Sergio Martinez of Argentina. All right. Hope we all learned something today. Hope you had a good time. All right. And see you next time.